Noon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to my channel. My name is Tonia Barongo. I am a women's self-care and health coach for Black women over 40, and I help them with burnout, liberation through self-care. Now, welcome to my channel. This is the first time I'm going live, and I just felt like it was necessary to rather than just post a video with a few, bits of information here and there. If you're new to my channel, all I talk about here are self care for Black women and women of color. I also talk about travel, I talk about exiting, I talk about getting your best life in this lifetime. I'm all about liberating Black women from labor, people pleasing, burnout, and overwhelm because it's time to retire that role. So, welcome again to my channel if you're new here. And we're going to touch on a couple of things as we go through today's topic because I particularly wanted to talk about self care in the toxic work environment. If you are a lot of us, especially now, given the current political climate, are dealing with a toxic work environment. And that's going to become more prevalent as you lose more of DEI, as that's totally eradicated or eroded or dismantled, well, however you want to call it, as well as other worker protections. There's things like OSHA for those of us who work in healthcare. I don't know if any of you work in healthcare, but this is something that everyone needs to be concerned about. Now, I talk a lot about self care for Black women as a vehicle for liberation and becoming an undomesticated woman, throwing off that cape, throwing off and getting off the altar of other people's expectations. For generations, y'all, for generations, Black women have not had access to self care as it's laid out in mainstream. Mainstream self care, there's a difference between the self care we as Black women, we as Black people should be practicing versus the version of self care that's out there. I call that the colonized version of self care. It is inaccessible, it is largely superficial. And it's toxic in its own right. Why? Because a lot of the underpinnings of it have to do with exploitation and appropriation of other groups' wellness, traditional wellness practices. Now, I've talked about this on my channel. I've on other videos. I've also talked about this on my website, freedomatthecrossroads.com, on my blog. I've talked about self-care, what it should look like, not the mainstream version that you see with all the crazy pretty pictures. Not that there's anything wrong specifically with, treating yourself to a spa or what have you. But the average woman does not access or has no access to self care in that realm. One, you have the issues of cost, especially now when we're dealing with an economy that's very volatile, that's problematic right now, and a lot of people are, let's just call it what it is, very nervous about the economy. Now, when you add that into the context of accessing self care as a Black person, given the types of things we have to do with, we deal with a number of points of intersection where we are having to navigate as Black people. Let's not even talk about Black women, but as Black people, where we're having to navigate institutionalized racism and state sanctioned violence against Black people and people of color. Now, when you add in the additional intersection of being a Black woman, you see how that gets more and more complicated. So, when we talk about self care, how do you self care in a toxic work environment? A lot of us, a lot of my clients, a lot of people I've talked to myself have discuss this issue ad nauseum because everyone understands. If you are a person of color, if you are a black person, if you are a black woman specifically, and this is a home for black women where I talk about our issues in the context of self-care, wellness, and liberation for us in those terms. Now, when you talk about how do I self-care given the current environment that we're living in, the socio-political environment that we're living in as black women, how do you self-care in a toxic environment with that context in operation? Well, the short answer is you got to be strategic, right? The short answer is you have to be strategic. A more detailed version of that means that you need to have a team around you, essentially. And that's going to look like accessing whatever resources you have at your disposal at your place of work, in addition to creating a support network for yourself as a black woman outside of work. And as any HR person will tell you, I am not an HR professional, but I have been through the ringer, my own personal experience, and other people sharing with me their own experiences too. HR is not your friend. Okay? HR is not your friend. So keep that at the back of your mind when you're asking yourself, okay, I don't have I'm not going to be able to leave this toxic job. And this a lot of people, it's very easy, or it comes off as being very easy and simplistic. Hi, it comes, as being very easy and simplistic, when someone says, well, just leave that toxic job. Well, in this current economy, this is not, an employee's playground right now. We are more than paying for the fact that, during COVID and everything and post COVID, there was that bubble in time where, people were job hopping because they wanted a better work life balance, et cetera, et cetera. Well, now we're getting the backlash from that now. So not only are we dealing with the backlash of that, but we're also dealing with all these other factors that play into it, especially if you're a person of color, especially if you are a black woman, period. So you need all these things when it comes to, okay, how do I self-care? I know I need to self-care. I know that self-care, my personal health and well-being is critical, not just to surviving this current stuff we're dealing with, but also if you want to be beyond survival mode, if you want to thrive. A lot of people are saying, okay, well, leave, exit. Okay, some people have a plan where they want to, say, for instance, live abroad, write out the political situation here in the US. But for the average person, that is not possible, especially when you add in the statistics that more than 50% of Americans do not have a passport. So if you don't have a passport, things are being going here and there in terms of government agencies being defunded and so on and so forth. Passport, that's not going to be your main issue. Your main issue is going to be securing your resources, et cetera, so that you can take care of your health and wellness in the interim. And I wanted to address this topic now because I've heard, a lot of creators that are saying, oh, well, you can do this, you can do that. Why not just, leave the country and so on and so forth? I'm speaking to the people that can't do that for whatever reason, or, whether it's a choice or whether it's something you just can't do. So how do you survive a toxic work environment in terms of self-care? How do you self-care with all of that? You're going to need to be strategic. That's the short answer. In depth, you're going to have to do a little research. And I say research in terms of what resources that will help me support and strengthen my practices in terms of taking care and prioritizing my own health and well-being. What resources that I don't have to pay for, are available through my employer. Yes, might have your health coverage through your employer, but those require copays as well, right? You want to start with those things that you don't actually have to pay for. Those resources and support entities or structures that you don't need to pay for. And that means you're going to have to do what? You're going to have to go to your benefits page on your company's website or what have you. Start looking for those resources that will help you take care of you. Because if you're not okay, your household is not okay, and your community is not okay. And I'll talk about that in another video where I am going to also talk about what that means for us as a community of Black women and what that means for us as a community. I will say that you can judge the health of a community based on the health of the women in that community. Let me repeat that. You can judge the status, the health status of a community. You can get a very good idea of the health status of a community based on the health status of the women in that community. And I say that because we live globally. This is a global patriarchy, whether we like it or not, whether it's in the process of falling like other empires do. The reality of it is that in the here and now, we exist under a patriarchy. And with that comes a lot of toxicity in and of itself. And it ranges, there is a continuum, if you will, of the repercussions of patriarchy depending on where you are in the world. Having said that, women, the labor of women is a lot. In terms of what women have been carrying for centuries, for generations. Add in the additional dimension of being a Black woman, and it's just unsustainable. And so now we have a situation where when you look at the health stats, the health outcomes, are improvements, the kind of improvements you would expect in 2025 for us to have in terms of health outcomes and overall well-being as a population of Black women. They're still very grim, especially fetal and maternal health, and in terms of their health outcomes. Black women are several times more likely to die in childbirth, and the same applies for infants. So that's a whole nother discussion that healthcare providers, there are plenty of creators that talk about that who are either doctors, nurses, or health providers who speak on that at length. I want to focus on self-care because we need practical approaches to surviving and thriving in a toxic work environment and arguably a toxic country. So, back to that. You need to access whatever free resources are available to you as an employee in your place of work, regardless of where you work. Next thing, you need to coordinate, do a little more research as well in terms of what benefits that I'm paying for as an employee, that I'm paying for, that I can use as an additional support for my health and well being. Because what needs to happen? You need to do all your research, gather your resources, and then you have a good idea of, okay, where do I need to fill in the gap? The next thing you want to address is support networks. We live in a country that is very anti-community. It's very individualistic. It's very exploitative. And that's something we as a people need to fully dismantle in our own communities, because all of those processes, all of those mindsets, all of those ways of doing things, they are largely rooted in white supremacy and exploitation. And we are a people that ancestrally have utilized traditional practices that involve community and that involve both the community aspect, the environmental aspect, as well as the individual aspect. The colonized version of self care that is largely popularized in social media is very individualistic and it's very superficial and it's exploitative. It is designed to separate you from your money. And there is nothing that says self care needs to involve you emptying your pockets. You can do hardcore, meaningful self care if you decenter white supremacy in terms of how you interact and engage with that whole notion of self care. When you understand that self care, this is something that one, we previously in this part of the world were denied access to self-care. We weren't allowed to nurture ourselves in the ways and traditions of our own people. For instance, I'm going to tap into my own personal background where I'm a child. I consider myself a bicultural child and someone who is at the crossroads because I come from two different cultures. I have the African culture from the West Africa, and I have the Black culture here from the USA. And I remember growing up on the continent as a child, there are certain self care practices based on the life cycles of women. And I'm going to give an example from my region, the south southern portion of Nigeria, where there is something we do in when a woman is getting married and when she is giving birth and post birth. But just to give you a good example of that, I'm going to talk about the just a brief description of what's involved when a woman is getting ready to shift into the cycle where she's, traditionally becoming getting married, prepping for marriage. And that involves a principle we call, or a practice we call, the fattening room. Now, it's not about getting fat, but it's about pampering, taking care of the woman, and it's usually done by elderly women in the family and in the community where she is in basically encapsulated in love and nurturing. They give wisdom, they pass down ancient wisdom, they give directives and wisdom on herbology, like how to take care of your do your personal hygiene, how you take care of yourself in terms of when you engage in sexual intercourse, all of these things. So it's very complex, and I'm simplifying it just to give you an idea of what that looks like. But these are traditional ancient practices that we were separated from when our people were brought here, when our people were enslaved, stolen from our homeland. A lot of these traditions were lost. And this was just one example of a self-care practice that was unique to women in this region of the country and in our family. And it's something that is community based as well. Everyone has some variation of that, kind of like everyone, say for instance, when it comes to a recipe, everyone has their twist on their mom's apple pie or their mom's peach cobbler or whatever. Same thing applies when it comes to self-care practices and indigenous self-care practices and the way they were created. They exist pretty much everywhere in indigenous cultures, African and indigenous cultures, But there is a twist depending on where you are environmentally. If you're in a more arid part of the world, there are practices that are put in place to account for that. And so all of these practices, as they should be done, always have an environmental aspect of it. There's an environmental aspect of it. There is a community, there is an individual. Why? Because our people, we come from a group of people that understand that everything is connected. And so this version of self-care is very superficial. The colonized version is very superficial and is divorced from a lot of those critical factors and portions that play into making that soup called self-care that nourishes you from the inside and out. So back again, toxic work environment. How do you self-care? Well, not only do you access whatever free services, amenities you have through your work, but you also need to see and learn, find out, figure out what is covered by your healthcare provider, by your network. You want to see where can I cut out expenses. A good way to really build a robust self-care kit and strategy is to know who's in network so you're not paying extra in this economy, so that you also know, well, what are my options in terms of healthcare providers. I'm in the process too of making sure that I have healthcare providers that are at the very least people of color. Why? Because I too work in healthcare and I know what the statistics are. And if you know of anything, if you've been doing any reading whatsoever, just in social media alone, the truth is out in terms of how we're treated. We know what it is anecdotally. We know what the historical record has shown, how Black people and people of color have been treated in healthcare in this country. And so very little, unfortunately, has changed in that regard. That's my opinion, based on what I've seen, what I've heard anecdotally, and what I've read. That has not changed a whole lot. If I have to strenuously advocate to be heard in the healthcare arena as a patient, that tells me that something's wrong with that system. When you understand that institutionalized racism exists across all structures in this country, that is the default. And so I made a conscious decision this year to start making sure that all of my providers, at the very least, are people of color. This is just the times that we live in. When things improve, I will reassess. In the meantime, I'm going to make sure that my OBGYN is a woman of color at the very least. Perfectly, it would be a Black woman. Those are and anybody has a problem with it, argue with your mama. I've known enough and experienced enough to know that my health outcomes are better when I have a person of color or a Black person taking care of my healthcare needs. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't still advocate for yourself in the healthcare space, but your health outcomes are more than likely going to be better than they would with someone who is non-Black, period, point blank. So this is another portion that you want to address when it comes to your self-care, and tying all of this together to create an environment for yourself that's going to still nurture you and protect you even in a toxic work environment. That means, one, your resources, what is free, what you have to co-pay for, expand, find out, figure out what that looks like. Next, you're going to have to Be strategic. You're going to have to put in protections in place. And that means talking to trusted people who are knowledgeable about the HR space so that you can put protections in place when it comes to your job. Because one thing we know, when you start setting boundaries, and which is one of the fundamental pillars of self care, when you start setting boundaries, anyone or anything or any institution that benefits from you not setting boundaries is always going to push back. I always tell my community, and I always tell clients, potential clients, that self care is a radical thing. And it is a revolutionary thing when Black people do it, even more so when Black women do it. Someone's going to have something to say. I made a post on Instagram where I was showing one of my decorations here in my, when I come right through the door, the passageway, I have a sign that says no free labor. And that is a reminder to me that anything having to do with me requires a boundary. Boundaries different from barriers. Boundaries are protective. Barriers are exclusionary. So that's a whole, for anybody who's wondering what that is. However, again, you're going to take care of the free stuff, employee free access resources that will help you with things like mindfulness tapes, webinars that are help you with meditation and body regulation, things of that nature. Whatever is freely accessible through the workplace, do that. The next thing, you're going to go to the resources available through your healthcare provider according to what's available in your employee health packet. So that's research there. The next thing is you want to add the component of protecting your job. Because one thing we know as Black people and as Black women is that DEI is gone. DEI is gone. The EEOC, all of these things, that all of these institutions that have historically um, protected employees, generally speaking, protected people with disabilities, veterans, and et cetera, all of these things are being dismantled. So when you are creating your self-care plan and your self-care toolkit, unfortunately, these are things you're going to have to consider. You're going to have to say, okay, what can I do to protect my job in the event that I need to set a hard boundary in a toxic work environment? There's going to be pushback. Say, for instance, an employer wants you to, this is just a, you know, odd example or whatever out in the wind. Say, for instance, an employer wants you to work overtime regardless of whether or not you want to do it. In other words, they're trying to mandate overtime. And you're saying, hey, I don't do work overtime. I only do my 40 hours a week. I have obligations outside of this. That's not something I can do. And then having to navigate an employer that is pushing back against that, trying to force you, in essence, to do work, additional work that by and large is going to affect you physiologically. It's going to impact your health and wellness. When you are overworked, overwhelmed, burned out, guess what? You suffer, and those who rely on you, because you are the center of your household, those who rely on you suffer as well. So, again, you're going to need to access. There are so many communities now that are online, that are on Facebook, some are on other platforms, support networks for Black women. I believe also on my website, Freedom at the Crossroads. When I get offline, I will make sure I drop the link, because for my website, where I do have on one of my blog posts a number of resources you can access, like therapy for Black girls, that's free, that also has a whole database of therapists that are regional as well, that are POC and Black therapists that you can access. Some give free resources. There's a NAP ministry is one as well. There's also if you don't have a library card, get a library card. There are a number of free publications you can get through your library that help with mental health. You can get books, you can get readings, things of that nature through your public library, but you're going to need to do that on your own. You're going to need to check those resources. You're going to have to Google in your region. I know that there are some regions here in some resources here in the Midwest, but that's only for the Midwest. So if you're in a region other than the Midwest, you might want to check yours, Google that. There are a number of groups on Facebook. There is a couple of huge creators here, Black women creators that are amazing, that have huge supportive communities for Black women to network and connect and form community, because that's going to be critical too. Start building your support. If you don't have a support network, I know some of us are introverts, believe it or not, so am I. But building a network, especially in this environment that we're living in right now in 2025, not having a community of trusted people around you is a problem. And it's going to impact you in terms of your self-care plan and strategy. What I also say, you got to protect your money, you got to protect your health, and you've got to protect yourself physically. And when I say that, I speak to your self-care needs to also include an emergency preparedness aspect as well. I was blessed enough to be one of those kids that was heavily into martial arts. So I have a background in martial arts, karate and taekwondo. I took those a lot as a child. I believe self-defense for women is necessary regardless of whether you're a Black woman. We know the stats on that too. Not good in terms of femicide, things of that nature. Not trying to scare anybody, but these are things we need to consider when we talk about self-care, even in the workplace, because I speak to that because there have been instances, a lot of instances, some have been very public on the news, where women were in a toxic work environment. They got into confrontations with a coworker that had issues, and they were unfortunately unalived or hurt in the place of work. And then you have instances too where the employer knew that this person or people were problematic and were potentially dangerous, but it wasn't, addressed and taken seriously like it should have been. And so what ends up happening? You suffer. And so these are all things that you need to consider when you're talking about self-care, period. Now, in a toxic work environment, it's all extra. It's all about protecting your job, making sure you protect your job. It's all about making sure you have built or are building a safe community outside of the workplace, so that you have a place where you feel safe and you can share experiences, get the necessary support you need community wise, and then you address your own individual needs as well. So that means too, even at work, you can, even in a toxic work environment, take it from somebody who with the experience, it is possible, not that it's going to be super easy, but it is possible to create and self-care effectively enough in a toxic work environment until you either exit that place or you make some other decisions. And so that's everybody, has to do their own cost benefit analysis. I've done mine. but you're going to need to do that. You're going to need to make those evaluations on your own. But these are some basic tools, that the basic tools and strategies that will help you not just survive but thrive, effectively thrive to a certain degree, even in the work in even in a toxic work environment. And when you have those protections that you need, when you have those structures around you where you can protect, where your job is protected, you're not worrying about that, where you can set boundaries and not worry about repercussions or backlash from toxic employers. So when you've done all of that, you can move forward. The next thing, like I said, you're just going to have to set those boundaries. You're going to start having to do the internal work too, where where you're unpacking a lot of that superwoman complex stuff, where you start unpacking that stuff. Because when you start on your self-care journey, and a lot of times people think that, oh, self-care is, I'm just gonna, lose weight and get, lose the unhealthy weight and keep it moving. No, self-care actually is an internal, inside out process, largely because to get to that taking that first step is a mental thing. We are cogs in a wheel. We exist in a society where people are basically zombified in moving forward and working for employers. This is an economy that does not produce in the traditional way of produce. It just exploits and extracts labor. And so you get to a point that you become conditioned to being a cog in the wheel, and you're just moving on autopilot. And it's not until you have that awareness, that you have that awakening, you have that, oh my God, my life is just going by and just one foot in. This is not life. This is not living. It's not until you have that mental awakening that you begin to interrupt that conditioning and deconstruct it. And so that's why I speak to the fact that self-care is an internal process first, and it works its way out. Once you start dismantling and deconstructing your own biases, anti-blackness, your own conditioning from living in a, let's call it what it is, in a racist society that internalized racism, there's no way, as a person of color or as a black woman, black person, that you are not internalizing some of that ish inside. And so when you begin that deconstructive process where you're decolonizing your own wellness, health and wellness, all of your processes that contribute to your health and wellness, it's not until you start deconstructing and pulling out that stuff that you begin to actually make progress. You can actually step outside of that and then begin to take that weight off of you. So that's where things like setting boundaries comes in. We've been conditioned to have none. Specifically, Black women have been conditioned in general terms to just carry everything and keep carrying it until we have a pattern interrupt, which for us was the elections, right? For most of us, it was the elections. If you weren't already there then, you are now, unless you're part of the 8% and not the 92%. So I'm going to leave it right there. But it's, again, boundaries, protect your resources, and your part of your resources are your source of income, because that's what keeps the lights on, that's what keeps you fed, that's what keeps the roof over your house. And when you're worried about money, it takes a toll on you too. It takes a toll on your emotional health, it takes a toll on your mental health, it takes a toll on your physical health, because you can't sleep, you can't rest, you're overwhelmed, and you're unfocused. So that's why you need these parts. You need to pull all of these things together when you are putting together a self-care kit, self-care toolkit rather. I like to call it self-care toolkit, strategy, bag, or whatever you want to call it. But these are essential pieces that you need to have if you're going to survive and get beyond surviving in a toxic work environment in the meantime. I used to always hear elders in my family and even on the news and in the community say when I was growing up, no condition is permanent in this world. And that is true. And so if you have if specifically for anyone who's talking about, especially if you want to do your black sit. If you're going to black sit from the US or you're going to exit from a toxic work environment into one that is potentially much healthier for you, you're going to need to have these strategies in place. You're going to need to have a toolkit because that will help you develop your blueprint, your plan of action for moving forward. You want to be healthy. You want to live your best life. You want to be able to see a path forward. You want to elevate your life. You can't do any of that if self care is not foundational to you. And so I just wanted to share that on there. Share that today on, I call this Self-Care Sundays. Again, this is my first time going live. I wanted to thank you all for, joining me. A couple of people have come in and out, and thank you for just joining. And I'm going to do this again at some later date, but this is it for now. But if you want to hear more from me, you want to listen in to my channel, I eventually have a couple of guests, have some friends I've been connecting to, and we are all obsessed with self-care for Black women and self-care for women of color as well. And so I have a couple of ladies around the world. We like to talk about this. We like to talk about breaking down the patriarchy. We like to talk about self-care under patriarchy and getting from under that. Liberating, getting off the altar of other people's expectations, living your best healthy life as a Black woman. That is more than possible, but self-care has to be the foundation and the context for all of that. So thank you for joining me. Till next time, I'm going to sign off and drop some comments below. If you've got questions too, drop some questions below and I will tackle them in the next go round. All right. Bye-bye.